Oh, there you go.
Hi. Okay. Thank you all for being here today and for allowing me to share this time with you. This topic of genetics and epigenetics is one that some people go, wow, this is, really something I'm interested in learning more about. And others are like, well, I don't really know how it's, I kind of get it already. So I struggled with how to, at what level and how to present this information for a diverse group such as yourselves. And so I welcome questions. I will just kind of jump into the material and we will go through it. Again, this is kind of an introduction to what's called epigenetics, and I will just start explaining what all of this is about. So the topic is how environment influences our health, our mental health, and our behavior, which really goes along with your social wellness topic for this week. And I know you see my favorite mice over here, and I'm going to tell you about these mice at the end of our presentation, but they are really important to this topic and our understanding of epigenetics. Let's see. Oh, okay. So I'm sorry, my slides went forward too fast. So now I'm having to figure out how I go back in this. Okay. Wait, there we go. Wait a minute, I'm still going the wrong way. There we go. Okay, I am so sorry for that. There's me and my email in case you want to get in touch. So most of us learned and we were educated about Charles Darwin and evolution and how evolution creates different types of living beings. We also learned about Mendel and the peas that he worked with that really helped us understand how people have different traits. And it led to us understanding what genes are. So that's some of the foundation. And I'll tell you, that's what most of us learn in school. And that's kind of the end of it in school is, well, we learn that genes have a really big impact on our body. We get our genes from our parents. If you ask patients, people especially who have something like diabetes, what caused their diabetes? A lot of people will say to you something like, well, it's bad genes, I guess. I inherited it from my parents. My family, it runs in my family. So they will give you an explanation of that somehow this happened to them because of their genes. That's only part of the story. So we're going to continue to see. But just a quick review of genetic inheritance. So what you see before you is something called a karyotype. Those are our chromosomes. And there are 23 pairs of chromosomes. We get one of each of these 23 from our mother, and one from each of these 23 pairs from our father. And that's what is called our chromosomal makeup. We could go a lot further into this. Most of you have already seen this material, but I need to present it just as a quick review so that we kind of know these are the chromosomes. On the chromosomes are all of what we call the DNA. And the DNA are units, make up genes. So there's long strands of DNA, and these strands of DNA constitute our genes. So these chromosomes and the genes that are on them are passed from one generation to the next. And there's very few alterations. There's very few changes or alterations in these genes as they're passed on. There's about 22,000 of them in every human being, give or take a few. Genes are the instructions for creating all of the amino acids that perform all the functions of the human body and its various organs and systems. So the genes are the building blocks of how our bodies perform. But the genes set the parameters for what is possible in a living organism. They set the parameters. In other words, we as human beings cannot grow wings, right? Horses can't either. Birds cannot grow a huge frontal cortex or brains, big brains or hooves. We think of genes as the hardware of a computer. This analogy helps to kind of get it. But that computer really cannot function well without some kind of software that guides it. So we think of genes as the hardware. You can also view DNA and the genes as a play. So just think of it like Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, right? And so the script that he wrote is the script. But every time that play is performed, it looks a little different, right? Depending on the production. So the script is the essence, but there's a lot of ability for how that plays out and how that looks. The word epigenetics means on top of or above the genes. So this is a process that impacts whether a gene functions at all in a given cell or how much this gene functions and when it functions. So you see over here that we have the DNA. We also see certain things called methyl groups that attach themselves to the DNA. We also see some things down here, these little balls that the DNA can wrap itself around, and those are called histone groups. It's not important to know that, but these are the mechanisms by which DNA is either expressed or bound up so that it cannot express. And so you see that that's a representation of some of the different epigenetic processes. So you've got all these genes, but some of them are active in certain cells and others are active in other cells, and that does change over time. And that's really what we're gonna talk most about today, is how do those changes occur? What causes sometimes our genes to be very active in certain areas, organs of our body, areas of our body, cells of our body, and what sometimes causes them to shut down or not function well. So these instructions, this epigenetic instruction, is influenced by the environmental cues. And again, we'll talk a lot about how does that actually happen. But that's really what leads us to this whole discussion of social wellness, is how does the environment actually get into our biology? The other thing to know about epigenetics is that these histones and these different methyl groups are often passed on in reproduction. So when we have genes that are functioning in a certain way, we may very well be passing those on to our offspring. So as I've briefly mentioned, all cells contain the same DNA. Every cell in your body has your full complement of 20-something thousand genes that's in every cell. It's just hard to wrap your mind around how that can even be, but it is. And But not every gene is functioning in all cells, obviously, or we just have one big confused biology. Many are shut down. Much of the epigenetics is programmed in the fetal development. So how a liver becomes a liver, how a heart becomes a heart, those are all part of epigenetic processes. But there's a small percentage of these 20,000 or so human genes that are modified throughout the lifetime beyond early fetal development. So we have genes that can be modified throughout our lifetime. And these appear to be very, very important to our health and our mental health, as well as behavior. So here's a quick summary. Epigenetic modifications do not change the DNA. They simply allow it to be expressed or not expressed. But that DNA does stay the same underlying the epigenetics. It can allow or prevent genes from being expressed or functioning. And it's best not to think of it like a light switch, but think of it more like a dimmer switch. So you can turn it up or down. Sometimes it's on or off, but usually it's up or down. I've kind of pointed these out, but there's two main ones, the histone modifications and the methylation. So in this case, the gene gets bound up by these around and wrapped tightly around what's called these histones. In other cases, you can have these modifications that come on the top that actually usually instruct it to perform more and maybe in a subtly different way. Okay, as I mentioned, only some genes appear to be influenced epigenetically. And these are many genes that are involved in mental health and behavior. And there's a big push to really study how does our environment impact epigenetic changes that make us more susceptible or less susceptible to mental health challenges or other chronic diseases. But we do know that how certain genes function can be influenced through mechanisms that come into play as a result of stress, the result of abuse or violence, the result of poverty, and many other environmental factors. And how we know that is what I'm going to continue to kind of try to illustrate. So I want to talk just real briefly. When I use the word environment in this context, I really mean anything that is outside of that DNA or that gene. So the environment can be the environment that a fetus had inside the mother as it's developing. It can be certain other processes going on in the cells and so on. So environment means, in a very global sense, everything that is impacting that DNA. So it's outside of the DNA, it can be external to the body, things like food, sunlight, toxins, social conditions, and many more. It can also be communication from other parts of the body or other genes. So that all of that constitutes environment. Genes often work together. It's not one gene, one trait. You know, there's not one gene that creates your eye color. There's not one gene that creates your skin color or the texture of your hair or your height or any of these things. Genes work together. There's many of them. They constantly interact and influence each other, as well as the epigenome influencing all of these genes. So it's very complex. We've all grown up hearing about nature versus nurture. I remember when I was in college, I had to write a paper. Now, this was a long time ago when I was in college. So, you know, please forgive me if I sound dated, but I am. When I was in college, it was all the rage. Was Skinner the way that things worked, or was it really more what your genetic inheritance said? Was it one or the other? We had to choose. Well, what we now know is it's not one or the other, that these two things are highly interactive. Like how your genes play out, how they express themselves, how well they function, how they work inside your body is highly dependent on the environment in which you live and in which they are living, the genes. So what we say now is that nature, the genes are actually activated by nurture. If you had a newborn mammal and that newborn mammal never saw daylight, then the rods and cones in the eyes would not develop and actuate themselves completely. They would be at a very different level of functioning than a being that had a normal amount of sunlight exposure, okay? The normal amount of sunlight exposure interacts with those rods and cones in the eyes and says, okay, this, you need to develop now. You need to start working. You need to come online. But without that sunlight, the rods and cones won't develop in the same way. Does that make sense? That there's some difference in that we have to have certain exposures to certain things in an environment for many of our processes to work. So nurture influences the expression of potential. We have a gene for speech, but if a child is not exposed to a lot of speech, then that gene will not function well. There's a critical period of time. So those are very blatant examples. Many other examples are much more subtle. But that's a way in which nature and nurture have to work together. Genes can't function without the proper environment, can't function well. Again, genetics is the hardware of the computer. Epigenetics is the software. You can't do much with the computer without some software, right? And the software tells the hardware what you want done and how to function. It's both of these things together. So when it comes to many diseases that we're talking about, or different conditions that we face as human beings, it's helpful to think about this. And I don't like guns, but I couldn't think of a better example than this. So here we are. If we think about the genes or the gun, and they are loaded. Now, maybe our genes tell us that we only have 1 or 2 chambers loaded in our gun, right? We only have a certain amount, but other people's genes may have all chambers loaded, right? But it takes an environmental factor to pull the trigger on the gun. So you wouldn't really have the disease unless you encountered and had something in your environment that actually triggered the disease. Now, some people are more likely to get a disease than others, but it still takes, for many of the diseases we have as human beings, it takes environmental phenomena to make that disease come to fruition in a human being. So think about alcohol. I think what we know is that certain people have a propensity, they become more addicted to alcohol more easily than others. Some people could drink quite a bit throughout their life and they never get dependent. Other people seem to get dependent relatively quickly if they have exposure to alcohol. But if those people who have a high propensity to become addicted to alcohol never drank alcohol, they would never have alcoholism, right? So it takes exposure to certain things. We think about diabetes type 2. Diabetes type 2 takes You may have a genetic propensity for it, but if you had a certain diet your whole life and you were an active individual, it's doubtful you would ever develop full-blown diabetes too. So Alzheimer's is like that, many forms of cancer. Again, with many forms of cancer, you have a propensity genetically, but it takes some environmental toxins, it takes exposure to certain things. Mental health disorders. What we see in mental health disorders and also in some of these other more physically based disorders is that a exposure to trauma, violence, and other social triggers tend to impact the propensity to have a mental health disorder. Okay. So there's critical times. The preconception and prenatal period are very critical times. Infancy and early childhood. You know, we have a lot of knowledge now that 0 to 3, 0 to 5 is so important for laying the groundwork on how healthy an individual is going to be lifelong. We're going to talk about that just a little bit more in a minute. Adolescence is another time where things are, biologically as well as mentally in somewhat of an upheaval and socially. So those are times that, there's often an opportunity to impact the system. These are critical times. And if we focus on, as a society, if we focused on really supporting people during these times, we could have a lot of impact. But changes to the epigenome can occur other times as well. They actually can occur lifelong. We're learning a lot about how to do that and when are times that are most likely. So there's mountains of studies, mountains and mountains and mountains of studies that show a strong relationship between trauma, poverty, with poor health and chronic disease. Many of us have heard about something called the Adverse Childhood Event Studies, ACEs. Very well known, been lots of follow-up studies. Children who were experienced trauma, and this is dose related. So the more trauma, the more likely there are to be long-lasting repercussions, have a much higher rate of common chronic diseases, both mental and physical, lifelong. So these traumatic events that happened at age 3, age 2, age 5, age 7, seem to have lifelong consequences. This is true, and it holds true, even if these people do not have behaviors that you think about, like smoking, drinking, that we know sometimes people do those to feel better and they're bad for you. Well, yes, that happens, but in spite of those, there's still a high propensity, a true relationship between early childhood trauma and disease later on, even if there's no other problems later on to cause those later chronic diseases. So when children are abused repeatedly, live in an abusive environment, they develop higher respiration rates, higher blood pressures, higher resting heart rate, and these persist. So these children learn from their environment. I need to be on guard. I need to be on the ready. My body needs to function quickly. And because their environment is scary. So their bodies adapt. This isn't conscious. This isn't learned behavior. This is their body adapting to their environment. And it serves them in the short run. But sadly, having that elevated respiration, blood pressure, results in ongoing problems later down the line in adulthood. So it serves a purpose at the time. It's just that it later has some unintended side effects that persist. The good news is that with support, changes in the environment, therapies, things we can do, we can modify that resting heart rate and blood pressures and so on. So correlation is not causation. We know all the ACEs studies started out as correlation. We saw this, we saw this. We think the two are connected, but how? How are those things happening inside the body? How does that outside trauma instruct our biology? How does that work? Well, we're going to talk for a second about something that might surprise you, and that's identical twins. So identical twins came from the same fertilized egg. They have the same DNA. They are exactly alike in their chromosomes and their DNA. But if you've ever seen identical twins, as they grow, they start to look subtly different. Think about the Property Brothers. If you ever watch HGTV, they look different from one another, right? They're not identical anymore. So why is that if they have the same DNA? They even have lived together their whole lives, but they've had different lives. And so what we can see through various processes in the lab is you can, just like you can look at DNA, you can look at the epigenome, those histones, those things I showed you that attach themselves. You can look at those. And as twins, identical twins grow up, their epigenomes diverge. They become different, their epigenomes. And that leads them to look differently, for their biologies to function differently. If you separated identical twins at birth and put them in very different environments, their epigenomes diverge very quickly. And so they are going to become much more rapidly human beings that differ from one another than those that are raised in the same environment. And that's kind of an explanation for what I'm talking about. Okay, a little bit deeper. How does it work? Again, environmental events that happen signal our central nervous system. Okay, so we see and we experience a violent event. It tells our central nervous system, okay, you need to respond to this. And it does. Releases a bunch of hormones, releases chemicals that get to the cellular level and start to tell that cell and the DNA within that cell, you need to take care of this and respond. You need to do something here. So much like I told you with the children, if it's repeated and repeated and repeated, then those processes just pretty much stay in place. All right. And that is what leads to, again, they can have an immediate benefit or a short-term benefit, or maybe it's a benefit to one cell or one organ, but it might not be, this change may not be a benefit in another arena. So today's healthcare, and we're all part of this healthcare world, it's all about chronic disease for the most part. I mean, we still take care of people who have acute injuries, that have an acute disease. We're all in the midst of COVID, and this is a topic that maybe is a nice little relief from COVID in some respects. But predominantly, when you're talking about primary care, you're talking about internal medicine, you're talking about long-term health challenges. These are all chronic diseases that we're facing, such as diabetes, hypertension. Even cancer is viewed as a chronic disease, in a sense, these days. And these following factors have been shown to have a significant contribution to whether someone gets these diseases or not. The quality of nutrition, you know, we know this, but that's part of our environment. How what's the quality of our nutrition that we have to help our cells function better. Chronic stress, we've already talked a lot about that, but it's a very critical part. Chronic stress is clearly a pathway that encourages chronic disease, okay? Exposure to toxins in the environment, something we probably don't talk enough about today, but there's a whole lot of toxins that we know lead to adding to that burden of how well the DNA and the cells can function. Low poverty and socioeconomic, high poverty, low socioeconomic status. And I have here perceived poverty because it is, to an extent, there's absolute poverty if someone does not have enough calories, adequate, healthy nutrition, adequate housing. But there's also perceived poverty, the social part of this, that if I perceive that I have a whole lot less of support, of material goods, of opportunity than the rest of the people that I see in my life, then that's perceived poverty, and that causes stress. That causes psychological stress, and that translates into biological stress through these different processes. Abuse and trauma we've already covered. So here is a example. When a threat is perceived by the brain, the brain releases certain hormones that cause that fight or flight or freeze response that we've all heard about. And this is automatic, it's not conscious, right? We don't sit there and think, oh, that is a bull charging at me. I need to instruct my hormones to respond quickly through my central nervous system. And please, cells, would you hear this message and translate it to the, and so it doesn't happen like that. It happens like that without any conscious control. Again, when these threats are frequent, it causes those productions of the flight or fight hormones to be on tap, right? They're there right where we need them, on tap, and maybe actually constantly bathing our organs in these hormones. These are great for acute situations. It's not helpful long-term to have these hormones functioning at a high level in the long term. So sometimes our bodies sacrifice the short-term safety for long-term. And that's kind of how I can, take this down to a level we can all get our arms around or maybe grasp. This is hard for me. It's hard for all of us sometimes to understand these are all processes. And I'm sorry if I'm not using enough of biology for some people, but I am a social worker. That's where I come from. So I'm interpreting this from a social work perspective. I've mentioned some of these critical times already. These are areas where we may have the highest impact if we really focus in on improving the health and welfare of these populations. But at any age, we can make a difference. Reducing exposures to toxin, improving nutrition, reducing stress, exercise, improving social status, reducing poverty, increasing social supports in the sense of safety. These are all things you hear about all day long. And I think for me, what, the big aha moment in all of this information for me is this is not learned behavior. Although learned behavior is important, right? And it does tell us how to sometimes get conscious control over some of these processes or change them, how to consciously change our environment. But these are all processes that are happening that are not at a conscious level. It is our bodies responding through these biological mechanisms to the external environment and changing how our underlying biology is functioning to adapt to our environments. So I talk about macro interventions. By that, I mean large scale, things we can do in a public health sense, in a population-based sense, how to improve the health for everybody, and especially certain groups that we need to help. You know, we work in a system that mainly works with individuals, and we try to improve the health of the patients that show up in the various offices in which we work. But if we can have a society that reduces income disparities and reduces poverty, that increases access to quality preconception and prenatal care, that has increased support for all children birth to age 5. So you get my drift. These are all very important ways that we can improve the health of large numbers of people through improved policies and services in our system. So this is a highly evolving field of study. There are other mechanisms that influence our health from the outside besides epigenetics. The immune response that we're getting from the COVID vaccines is an injection from the outside that is actually retraining parts of our RNA to recognize certain threats, and that would be the COVID vaccine. We don't get the COVID killed virus directly in this vaccine. We're getting instructions on how our immune system and an activation of our immune system from this injection that tells that how to respond. So this is a highly evolving field of study. Be careful. You will see a lot of entrepreneurial types, and entrepreneurship is good, but you will see people out marketing, you know, this pill can change the epigenetics of your system, or take this supplement to change your epigenome. And that stuff is maybe on track and maybe not. You have to be very careful. As with anything like this that becomes kind of popular in terms of knowledge and is new and different, you will see so you get my drift. I would just caution you to be a little bit careful with what you might see in the mass media about epigenetics. So here's my conclusion. I hope I'm okay on time. I think I'm doing all right. I just have a little bit more to say. This knowledge of epigenetics can help us understand that what we do in our environment is very important. It's very important to us today, but it's also very critical in terms of our children, because some of this is passed on to them when we reproduce. And it's also, you know, those critical times that we know when children are developing in their early years, they are more susceptible to their environment. Their environment has a bigger role in directly impacting how their biology is going to unfold and come online. So really supporting our younger population and our childbearing age adults with more education and more support can be very critical in the long run to all of us. All right, now about these mice that I told you, I promised you I would tell you about these mice. You're going to find this a little hard to believe, but these are mice. You know, we can do a lot of things with mice in a laboratory you can't do with anyone else. Mice happen to be quite a bit like human beings. They're not everything that we are, obviously, but we study them a lot because their biology does translate a lot to us. Well, they've over the years developed lab mice, a certain strain. They're called agouti mice. And these agouti mice are all genetically identical. So their DNA is identical. Unlike you and me, we've got some variations in our DNA. These mice actually, the agouti mice, identical genes. So you might look at these mice and say, well, these mice, all 5 of these mice have identical genes. Not one thing is different. They are the same as those identical twins. So you might look at them and you might say, well, they had different environments. So you might think the one on the left got fed a lot more calories than the one on the right. Well, actually, these mice had identical environments, except for one thing. So they got fed the same calories, they got the same amount of exercise, they had the same sawdust in their cages, they had the same water, they had the same amount of handling, the same everything, except one thing was different. And that was the diet of their mothers. Their mothers had different diets. Their mothers had the same DNA. Their fathers had the same DNA. But the mothers had different diets. So this is my take home to you. We can have, you know, great variation from the difference of just the environment and just certain things in the environment. And, you know, I hope that you have found this time you spent today somewhat useful. And I don't know, Lindsay, do we have a few seconds or minutes for any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Very intriguing information. I think, you know, it is kind of stuff we are aware of or know about, but don't really necessarily always realize the deeper impact that it can have on us and others. So I think it was a very intriguing and interesting and valuable approach to for some information we might already be aware of, but not entirely. So yeah, if you have anybody with questions, feel free if you want to unmute and ask, or if you feel more comfortable just putting them in the chat box, absolutely. And we do have some time to take care of some of those. So Stacy asked, what are the epigenetics of Alzheimer's disease?
You know, I have not looked into the details of that, but again, there seems to be associations, at least. There's certain genes that they have been able to isolate that do have an impact on Alzheimer's. It does appear that nutrition plays a role in the whether one's going to develop Alzheimer's or not. I think it is a lot of the same factors we talk about time and again. Sometimes I think with different human beings, you know, the reason one human being might develop diabetes too, and another human being develops Alzheimer's is because they may have stress, same levels of stress and so on, but it sometimes is that underlying genetics that make us predisposed to a certain disease, right? And then you add, you know, the environmental factors that tend to have an impact on a lot of different systems and organs, and that creates an outcome, a certain outcome. But I have not looked into Alzheimer's in any detail, so I'm sorry I can't answer you more fully.
Yes, we did have someone ask about, you know, the slides presentation available to you. Yes, I'll send a follow-up email out to attendees that will include the slides that you can refer back to. And we'll also have, again, this is recorded, have that link to you all.
Well, if there's no other, Lindsay, I'll let you have it back. And I've really appreciated you all as an audience today. And again, I hope that this added at least a few snippets of information that you'll find useful in your lives and in your work. And thank you again for your time and attention.
Yes, thank you, Terry, and thank you all for joining us today.